Aloha! This is chapter 24.2, the Partition of Africa. The big question is, why did it take so long for Europeans to penetrate into Africa and finally conquer it and colonize it? It's kind of surprising because if you look geographically, Africa is the closest continent to Europe. So the main reason is probably because it was just dangerous. The Africans themselves were very capable of defending themselves, and they did not want to have Europeans come and try to take over naturally. And also just the topography was very difficult, and also a lot of diseases that kept Europeans from being able to penetrate very far. Most early explorers and missionaries died, for example, 5 years. That was a very long lifespan for a missionary at this time. We do have some very notable exceptions, though. One of the biggest ones is Dr. Livingstone, and his story is just incredible. He was a child of the Industrial Revolution, one of those child workers that you learned about in previous chapters. He, at the age of 10, his family sent him off to go work in a cotton mill, and he worked as a piecer. He would work putting together bits of thread that had broken apart, and he worked from 6 o'clock in the morning all the way until 8 o'clock at night. But after that, I think he had just an extraordinary amount of energy because he was able to go to school. By the time he was 18, he actually qualified to go to medical school. I do not know how anybody could have that much energy. But his family really valued education. Both his parents were literate, and his dad was a lay preacher, and his dad had a really great love for theology, and that really influenced David Livingstone. And so when he went to medical school, his heart's desire was actually to become a medical doctor and to become a missionary. He meets another missionary who was well known at the time, and his name was Robert Moffat. Robert Moffat had a mission station in South Africa and invited Livingstone to come and work there. So for a few years he did that, but I think personality clashes kind of prohibited that from really working out well. So Livingstone eventually starts out moving north. After a few years, he gets a job with the Royal Geographic Society and the British government to try to find the source of the Nile, because that was of high priority to both of these groups, because for trade reasons, the British government wants to find new markets for all the goods that are being produced in these factories back in England, and they also want to be able to bring natural resources out. And what better way to do that than via the Nile? Because the Nile was one of the few navigable rivers on the continent of Africa. Actually, there were several, and we need to talk about them. So one of the first ones is the Nile, which goes from north to south, and you can see it on this map. Also, the Congo River, which was in kind of central Africa, it opened up a lot of that central territory. And then you have the Zambezi River down farther south, and this is actually where Livingstone eventually ends up. He dies at the age of 60 next to the Zambezi River, and his heart is going to be buried next to the Zambezi River. And then they tried to preserve the body, and they sent it back to England to be buried in Westminster. I think they probably used salt to preserve it, kind of like a big mummy. I don't know. There's also the Niger River, because during this time, European countries are kind of competing with one another. They all want to have colonies. It gives each country a sense of prestige to own a colony. And then also there's all the natural resources. If you remember back in the early 1800s, when Napoleon swept through Europe, he gets defeated, and they put Europe back together again, and they make sure that France will never do that again. They made a new country, and it was a country that was sandwiched right in between the Netherlands, France, and Germany. And that new country was called Belgium. Well, Belgium was an infant country. It had nothing, really. And so when Africa was just starting to open up, the King of Belgium, Leopold II, asked for and received a territory right in the center of Africa, right along the Congo River. And this is going to become his. It was not owned by the government, it was personally owned by him. He was totally a player, because to anyone who asked him, he always sounded very, very humanitarian. He's always said that his motives were to spread civilization and make sure that the people were taken care of and taught the Christian values and, all of these great sounding things. But the reality, if you went into the place that he owned, it was absolutely shocking. It was slavery. Even though by the mid 1800s, slavery for most European countries was a faux pas, and most European countries had outlawed it. And let's talk about the slave trade, actually, because these things are all interwoven. William Wilberforce, who was a British politician, had made it his life's goal to end the slave trade. He was in Parliament. Every year he would bring a bill to Parliament saying, we must outlaw the slave trade. It is an offense to God. It is evil. And every year they would turn it down because it was far too lucrative. And many of the British were getting wealthy from the slave trade. So finally, in the 1820s, the slave trade is finally eradicated. However, that did not mean that slavery was made illegal. It just made the slave trade illegal. Even slavery is going to be abolished right before William Wilberforce dies. I think William Wilberforce died about 6 days after it was finally abolished. By the mid-1800s, it hasn't been abolished by non-European countries. And so a lot of the slave trade shifts. It originally had been going westward and across the Atlantic Ocean. And when slavery is abolished, goes towards the east. I mean, there had always been slavery going in that direction, but that direction of the slave trade increases. Slavery was practiced and is somewhat even still practiced today. It's just not called slavery. Found in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula that it was still happening. But also, historians have found settlements of Africans who were transported to places like India and Saudi Arabia, even other farther east territories. So the slave trade was definitely going on during this time. Leopold II, even though he didn't call it slavery, his treatment of the people was very much a slave-like existence. If they refused to work, beating them to within an inch of their life, or sometimes even chopping off hands for those who refused to work, it was just barbaric. So when news of that style of treatment gets out to the rest of the European community, they're shocked. I'm really surprised that they actually stepped in. They took the territory away from Leopold II, but they made it into a government colony. The treatment did improve of the people. Also, the Catholic Church was invited to come in, and a lot of missions were set up. Also, this is what really motivated David Livingstone to keep going throughout his whole missionary career, because the slave trade was destroying Africa. It was depopulating the continent. And so his goal, his desire, was to try to find other things that Africans could use trading in order to make some money. Part of his desire to find the source of the Nile was really to improve the trade routes throughout Africa and enable the Africans to profit from other kinds of trade rather than the slave trade. Now, the reality is we know human nature, and it's very unlikely that the slave trade would have stopped simply because a new and better trade route was introduced. My guess is that the slave trade would have been happy to use those trade routes. What was Africa like before the Europeans, or right about the time that the Europeans started to make inroads into Africa? North Africa had a lot of contact with Europe. Well developed, it was Muslim territory. The Ottoman Empire had owned a lot of that territory. When the Ottoman Empire starts to diminish, unfortunately, they're not going to be left that way, because France looks with a greedy eye upon this territory and they quickly gobble that up. In fact, France is one of the bigger colonial powers in Africa. In West Africa, before the Europeans are able to make inroads, there was a kind of a religious revival. A man named Usman Dan Fodio, a religious leader, Sunni, mystic, and he was very charismatic and was able to gain a huge following, created kind of like a revival of Muslim Sharia law kingdom about where the Niger River bends. Up at the top of that bend, that's where his region was. It was kind of a renaissance for the African peoples there. People are they're starting to learn how to read. There's a improvement of law and order. There's a call to purify the religious practices of the area, and that kind of purification idea spreads. And so there's a renewal of Islamic law and Islamic traditions. And when the Europeans show up, that's a formidable force to fight against. And it takes quite a while for the French, who are the main colonizing power, they have difficulty subduing the region. The southern part of Africa, dominated by a tribal group called the Zulu. There were other African tribes living in the region. Most of these tribes had actually recently moved to the area. They had not lived there for many, many centuries like many of the other Africans. The Zulu were fairly new. They had one dynamic leader that set a trajectory, and that trajectory was opposition to the European encroachment. Their leader, Shaka Zulu, was really great at organizing military and training his military. He fought against the early Dutch, the Boers, who had been living along the coastline in the southern part of Africa. Their position gets challenged by the British because, of course, we know the British want to control all trade routes, and that was a strategic spot on the globe. So they bump the Boers out of the territory. And so the Boers decide they're not going to live under British rule. They hate that. So they pack up all their women and children and animals into wagons that they were using, those canvas-topped wagons, up north from the coastline of South Africa. It's all dry, dusty territory. They try to farm, but that's not a very successful thing. So mostly just cattle, until some guys are hanging out in a riverbed and they see some flashes. And so they suddenly figure out what they're seeing is diamonds. And then later on, they discover gold in the same region. They try to keep it a secret, but eventually the British find out about that and they start moving up to claim that territory too, because are you going to let that go? No, of course not. Well, Shaka Zulu, his people lived in the same region, and when they came in contact with the Boers, they had some epic battles. The Boers were just lucky to stay alive, pretty much. Even though the Zulu did not have the same kind of firepower that the Boers had, and still the Zulu were pretty hard to beat because they were that well trained and that well organized. It was very impressive. But the Boers eventually do beat Shaka Zulu, and they eventually create their Transvaal little empire up there. And then the British come and they conquer the Boers again. And this all happens over an 80-year time period. So this was happening throughout the 1800s. In East Africa, most of East Africa was just little tribes, but there was one very significant kingdom in East Africa, in Ethiopia. They are very, very proud of the fact that they were never conquered by European power. Okay, so you've probably heard that Italy came and conquered Ethiopia, but that is actually not accurate. There's actually two sections of Ethiopia. There's the coastal region, which is its own country, it's Eritrea, and then there's Ethiopia proper. So the Eritrea bit was actually conquered by the Italians, but the interior was never conquered. And that's partly due to just the rough terrain. Ethiopia is up on the highlands, and it was an easier place to defend, and so that's one of the reasons. And also, Ethiopia is a Christian kingdom, and I think Europeans had more difficulty in justifying their colonization of the region because one of the main motivations of the Europeans was to spread Christianity. So, with all of those things, I will stop there.